In this talk, I'm going to provide current evidence regarding a core transdiagnostic process. This is a talk that I gave to the Transdiagnostic Conference in Cambridge recently, and I'm going to reproduce it for the sake of YouTube. There's lots of other areas that relate to this talk, and I've listed some of these here. These are other talks that I've given that you can access separately. And at the conference, Sarah Tai, my colleague, talked in more detail about method of levels therapy, whereas this talk is really just focusing on the evidence base and the theory behind a core transdiagnostic process. Okay, so what am I going to cover? First, why should it be useful to identify a core transdiagnostic process? What is the evidence for it, both in our group and in other groups? And then I introduce Perceptual Control Theory to try and explain what that core transdiagnostic process might be. Then I talk you through how that might be explaining how the familiar cognitive and behavioural processes have their shared effects, and then share with you some evidence around this potential explanation of the core process as goal conflict awareness, which I'll explain in more detail. And then I'll briefly talk about the interventions that we use. Okay, so why is it useful to identify a core transdiagnostic process? I would say it's a much more parsimonious way of approaching this. When we completed our transdiagnostic book in 2004, we had between 12 and 15 different cognitive and behavioural processes that are transdiagnostic, which proved very difficult to produce any kind of integrative, simple model from. And I think theories should be no more complex than they need to be. That is the rule of parsimony. And obviously, the clearer and more specific a theory, the tighter the links with informing practice can be. And you see that in method levels therapy. And therefore, the simpler the intervention can be, and arguably therefore more efficient to provide, more flexible to provide, and cheaper in terms of training costs. So there's a really strong bounty, there's a real strong potential there once we've identified a core transdiagnostic process. Okay, so there's 3 studies that our research group have conducted and published. The first one, led by Timothy Bird, published in 2013. Timothy worked with a colleague, Chris Dickens, by looking at both student populations and a community population of people with chronic physical illness, and included the same 3 different measures of processes: experiential avoidance, worry, and thought suppression. And he tested, using structural equation modelling, whether incorporating those 3 measures separately was more or less efficient, or accounted for more of the variance in anxiety and depression scores than extracting what they had in common and then seeing whether that predicted anxiety and depression scores. And in the student population, we did that in a prospective manner, controlling for baseline symptoms. And it proved that the single factor solution predicted distress at least as well as the 3-factor solution. So therefore the parsimonious solution, I would argue, prevailed. Secondly, Trishna Patel, 2 years later, working with myself and David Veal, she went out of her way to recruit a wide clinical sample. She also recruited a community general population sample and a student sample for this study. And she developed her own questionnaire that had a separate question for each of the transdiagnostic processes in our review that we conducted many years ago, and cross-validated that with a number of standardized scales. And she conducted a factor analysis and used parallel analysis, which is a fairly well-recognized method to determine a number of factors, and she found a single factor. And that single factor correlated with 12 out of the 15 items over 0.4, was higher in the clinical and in all of the clinical than the community groups. Again, suggesting a single factor. And then more recently, When I went out to Perth and met Peter McAvoy, he told me about his clinic where he had over 300 patients who'd given him data on a wider range of cognitive behavioural and affect regulation measures. And again, we applied the same approach, a factor analysis, extracting factors. In this one, again, the single factor accounted for most of the variance. There was a clear a shift in the scree plot which showed the single factor solution. That single factor correlated with anxiety and depression independently. But plus, just to double and triple check, I also looked at how well that the second, third, fourth, fifth and sixth factors correlated with symptoms. They correlated very poorly with symptoms. It was only that core factor that seemed to correlate with them. But it's not just our group. There are other groups, and I've given some examples here. I won't go over each of them in detail, but they range in meta-analyses of many studies of emotion regulation, student studies, brain injury studies, studies that have been focused mainly on symptoms rather than processes, and at the bottom there a replication of a Trishna's study in a larger sample, actually at risk of suicide. So regardless of these slightly different ways that people are recruited, very different groups are continually converging on a single factor, i.e. if you report high levels of one cognitive and behavioural process or emotion regulation process, you also score highly on other measures, and it's the extent to which you correlate highly on multiple measures that seems to relate to your symptoms rather than any particular cluster or type of cognition, behaviour or affect regulation. So the evidence that there is a core process, I feel, is very robust even at this stage. But it raises the question of what it is. And I'm going to come to this from the direction of perceptual control theory, which I was intrigued in because of the convincing evidence even 20, 30 years ago that one of the main experiences, complaints, kind of factors involved in mental health problems is lack of control. And this has been known for many years, but it's rarely put or put forward as the core of what is going on in mental health problems. I thought the evidence was particularly convincing and therefore looked for a theory of control. And the theory of control, or control theory applied to human beings, is a theory developed back in the 50s and 60s called Perceptual Control Theory by Bill Powers. According to this theory, life itself is control, being healthy is having control, and mental health and well-being is having control. So control is just the normal state of affairs. It's making our experience of the world the way we want it to be. What undermines control? There can be a number of factors, but the most subtle and pernicious of these is what's called goal conflict, wanting two incompatible outcomes or incompatible experiences. And the notion of conflict obviously is not new to this whole field, but it's defined quite carefully within perceptual control theory. But just to give you some clinical examples, it's about wanting to be independent, to leave home, for example, and have your own career, whilst at the same time being dependent on your family, or conversely, your family needing you, and therefore feeling those two things are mutually exclusive. It can be about needing to re-experience memories, perhaps because you're going to be testifying in court for being a victim of a trauma, but at the same time not wanting to experience those memories because they're so distressing and upsetting. And it can be in a kind of phobic situation, the drive to try and get closer to the thing you're afraid of in order to face your fears and do the things you want to do in life, but at the same time to get further away because of your genuine feared danger. So this is goal conflict. And the thing about goal conflict is it cannot be resolved just by taking one side of these two goals. each side is not either right or wrong. It's not right or wrong to depend on other people or to be completely independent. Most people take their balance of the two. As a person faces their fears, they tend to balance their movement towards and away. And when people re-experience traumatic memories, they tend to do this in a regulated way, rather than kind of allowing everything to overwhelm them. They tend to actually control that process of when they're engaging in some form of exposure, for example. So if this conflict can't be resolved by taking one side, then it will need to be resolved in a different way. And what perceptual control theory proposes is that this conflict needs to reorganize. The goals in conflict need to change, and the way to do that is to bring someone's awareness to those goals and to what's behind them. What's the higher level goal that's behind them? Keep awareness there and explore these goals in experiential, perceptual detail. And that the longer that someone can do that in their awareness, the more likely they will get spontaneous changes that will help them to recover. And so through this trial and error process, they end up balancing and managing their goal conflict in a way that could not be instructed from the outside or even couldn't be logically deduced. It's something that emerges through this experiential process. If that's the case, and one might argue that many of us do that naturally lots of the time when thoughts pop into our head, when we talk through problems with people, maybe when we express it in some way in sort of art or music, etc. But if a person is not willing or able to bring their awareness to the source of their goal conflict, then this theory will predict that that is what maintains distress, and it will just continue if the person's not willing or able to bring their awareness to it. Okay, so do we have some evidence for this? Just in terms of colouring that a little bit, let's talk about what this might look like and why some of the traditional cognitive and behavioural processes might have this effect of interfering with resolving goal conflict. So going through the kind of domains that we covered in 2004, attention, selective attention was one key aspect. Also poor attentional control was a key transdiagnostic aspect domain we noticed. So if one is unable to control one's attention, it's drawn to threats, for example, that's really just drawn to one goal rather than to the alternative goal to pursue what you want despite the fear around you. And so that attentional capture, we would argue, is a problem because it brings awareness just towards one goal and not to the other side. When a person has intrusive memories and imagery, it interferes with their ability to control mental imagery in a way that they would do if they were imagining what they wanted as the outcome of their goals, because they're being intruded upon by memories and trying to suppress those memories that actually may be a very useful way of resolving the issue, but they are not attending to them and allowing them to be kind of exposed to, reinterpreted, reintegrated with the imagery and the memories that they're currently processing. Recurrent thinking, worry, rumination is another transdiagnostic process. We would argue that recurrent thinking, because of its perseverative nature, is taking attention away from where one's mind would naturally go to resolve goal conflicts by becoming overly preoccupied by ways of thinking about a problem that do not actually get to its root and get to the emotions and the experiences behind it. We propose that catastrophizing and self-criticism again focus on one side of the problem, and actually the way to manage this is to see the two sides of, for example, self-criticism. So bring that goal conflict into awareness. That emotional avoidance or experiential avoidance is going to interfere with processing goal conflict, because by its very nature, if an emotion is the way that we prepare to act in a certain state where our goals are blocked or we have threats, that if that emotion hangs around, it means we're in conflict and we're not worked out how to act yet. And so if one is unwilling or unable to bring those emotions into awareness, they're not going to sit with that difficult dilemma long enough to resolve it. And finally, safety-seeking behaviours and avoidance are another example of acting on one of your goals rather than sitting with the situation and contemplating different action alternatives. So in this slide, I wanted to put to you that it's not just a statistical reason why there might be a core process. You can actually see conceptually why the cognitive and behavioural processes we're familiar with might have at their roots their problem being that they keep important goals in conflict outside awareness. And we've got various ways that we've looked at this in our research. One of these is to review existing studies and to point out that processes like worry, for example, are not per se, not by of themselves dysfunctional. It's something about the way that that process is applied. And from a perceptual control theory perspective, it would be if that process was applied in a way that interfered with an important goal. And that, we would think, is what people describe as cognitive rigidity or lack of flexibility. And Lydia Morris, in a review, found that 4 transdiagnostic processes, rumination, perfectionism, impulsivity and compulsivity, were all associated with greater cognitive rigidity across disorders. And so it may be their association with cognitive rigidity which is maintaining the distress rather than necessarily the nature of those processes if they were carried out in a more flexible manner. Okay, we've also attempted to measure the awareness of conflict in a number of ways. Earlier studies that have done this tend to have found that implicit measures of goal conflict are more associated with distress, which would again support this account. And then we've done studies where we've looked at the mechanism in other interventions. So Hannah Gaffney looked at the accounts that people wrote of their problems to a computer that was asking questions to help them elaborate on their problems, and found that goal conflict awareness mediated the effect of their motivation to use the computerized therapy in reducing distress. And Rebecca Kelly, in an expressive writing task where people wrote about their problem in an open-ended way, found that those in the expressive writing condition wrote more about their conflict and had reduced distress about it after time. We also looked at goal conflict awareness in our spider phobia intervention. A paper looking at this is already published, looking at levels of control in the exposure. But in half of our participants who could control their exposure to an image presented on a computer of a spider, we also explored their awareness of their goals and the level of goal conflict and how that related to their avoidance over time. So before doing an exposure task, a structured interview elicited goals around conflict. They listed their reasons for wanting to face their fear of spiders, and they listed reasons for wanting to continue to avoid spiders. So these were in opposing directions. So therefore, the goal conflict measure was the multiple of how important those two opposing goals were. Okay, they also we also added together the list of both these sets of reasons, both for and against facing the spiders. And we used that total number of reasons as an index of the awareness of the goals in conflict, presuming that the more they list, the more able that they are to keep that those goals in awareness and list them during the task. And so this is fairly preliminary evidence, but we found that those people who listed more reasons, both for and against facing their fears, had less avoidance at follow-up, and you can see that in the bottom right corner. The other correlations were all in the direction that we expected, but relatively more modest. So you get this interesting dissociation whereby goal conflict itself is associated with a worse outcome, but the awareness of goal conflict is associated with a better outcome. And that's a challenging, these are challenging facets to measure separately, as you might imagine. And we've also got a scale called the Reorganisation of Conflict Scale, first designed by Sally Higginson and then studied in more detail by Tim Bird and Lydia Morris. And this actually has two subscales on it. One around conflicted control, which seems to assess the degree to which the person's single-mindedly pursuing one value or idea or goal in a way that's we would expect would increase conflict. And then goal conflict reorganisation, which are items that seem to pertain to the extent to which people can allow thoughts and feelings around their conflicted goals into their awareness and to stay there, which we would expect to be related to better outcomes. And we've looked at these in analogue and clinical samples. And this is Lydia's research that she's writing up at the moment. She's basically found that this inflexible conflict factor correlates with more symptoms and more of those other core processes measured, such as intolerance of uncertainty and psychological inflexibility. And conversely, the extent to which people can hold goal conflict in awareness correlates with decentering and curiosity subscales of the mindfulness measures. And we've generally found a similar pattern in clinical samples. So I've shared with you the statistical evidence for a core process, our theory as to what it might be, and some emerging evidence for that theoretical account. We have a variety of different formats of interventions which are transdiagnostic or essentially universal interventions provided in different formats to help people under their own control allow important goals and their conflict into their awareness and to talk, express and work through them. Method levels therapy, our Take Control course, the manual's just published on that. The Milo, which is the computerized therapist I mentioned, which is a form of artificial intelligence, and this process of doing exposure in a client-controlled way that helps people to do that in full awareness of their conflicting goals around addressing their fears. And so these interventions are reported elsewhere, but I wanted to summarise them here. So, in summary, already 14 years ago, we unveiled the evidence already there that the cognitive and behavioural processes that really were discovered and tested in a disorder-specific way are shared across disorders. But we've gone beyond that now. I would say in the last few years, we now got to the point of having robust and consistent evidence that these processes are actually part of a shared core process. And then I've also talked to you of evidence from our group putting forward that it's restricted awareness of goal conflict leading to loss of control that is that core process. And so we need to facilitate awareness to reduce it, whilst at the same time obviously facilitating the patient's control over the process. These, as you can see, these are very challenging things to measure, and it's especially challenging to assess interventions like these that are controlled by clients. And so I would welcome anyone watching this talk to get in touch with any questions or suggestions. Thank you very much.